Well, hello, very beautiful community. We've got a reaction video. Last time we went by the rules that we'd randomly scroll YouTube shorts on my chat channel, because that's where I don't watch YouTube videos. So that way we're going to get content that's similar to what we normally discuss rather than classical music and philosophy lectures. Let us begin. We're going to skip anything that's too obviously a baby donkey or a micro cow and things of such nature. Let's go. But I'll try to react to almost anything of social or political consequence. Who's ready? We're ready? Are we ready? We're ready. Okay. Let's
the idea
go.
that Ukraine is actually going to realistically throw Putin out of its territory
Owen
entirely
Matthews
is now, I think, pretty much off the cards. Several of the senior people that I spoke to, Zelensky people that I spoke to in Kiev over the last couple of weeks, believe still that they'll be able to do better in a spring offensive. But frankly, I'm not sure how that's going to happen, because they don't have air superiority. Even if they do get F-16s, they're not really going to achieve the kind of overwhelming air superiority that they need for a massive breakthrough. And they're basically going to be in the same situation as they are now, which is fighting through a very deep and comprehensively defended barrier of trenches and minefields and so on.
So I'll tell you what I'm thinking when I listen to Owen say this. But first, let's just frame what he's saying, which is in the big picture perspective, a product of our, what we might critically call partial strategy in Ukraine, that we're committed to certain things, but we don't know what more on top of these things we're committed to. Well, we're certainly committed to Ukraine's survival, we're committed to the war not escalating, and then we're committed with a small plus to a little more than that, but not much more. So it's a kind of a half strategy. There's a lack of a strategic vision for what we really want to happen in that space. That's related to a lack of our capacity to reimagine the global order. That's related to our capacity of being democratically stuck in the mud at home. Democracies that are in decline do not do well at reframing the international order. Having said this, if we have a version of stalemate, and don't get too picky about what that word means, in 2024, that could change in 2026. What we want to be careful about is that it doesn't change the wrong way, which is still possible. And that is why that strategy of giving Ukraine so much but not more is, whatever else is wrong with it, and I've just said what's wrong with it, is incapable of being clear with itself about what it's doing, right? Because there is no clear division between giving Ukraine enough to defend itself from further Russian encroachment versus giving Ukraine enough to asphyxiate out with the Russian encroachment, right? There is no fine line where you can say we're going to give enough for defense of something like the status quo, maybe a bit more, but not enough for significant progress against the status quo. You can't draw that line sharply. You just can't. That's the unpredictability of war that is palpably available as a truth to non-military experts. But here's what I'm thinking about really when Owen's speaking about this, and that's that, this is really a time when Ukraine is entering a new phase. And in my responsibility to you as a public intellectual, I'm always conscious of tilts and accentuations that I need to make and remake and refresh and cancel. That are about giving you signals that you might constructively use to make sense of what's going on. And so one of the signals I'm changing now, and if you've watched a lot of me over the last few months, you'd be sensitive to that already changing, is that I'm going from cartoonishly saying affirmative things about Ukraine's identity to saying aspirational things about Ukraine's identity. And that's to say, moving from this is Ukraine to what is Ukraine? And the reason this is very important for Ukraine is that after a year and a half plus, 2 years soon, really, of war, it's impossible to sustain the current mobilization across spheres of society without it becoming increasingly toxic. And that's a very hard ask. What do I mean by this? I mean that military mobilization has to remain there, but certain forms of ideological and cultural mobilization will no longer do the way they could do, and indeed did do really well at the beginning of the war. So the challenge for Ukraine is to maintain military mobilization, but to be more open and lessen cultural mobilization, ideological mobilization, so that there is much more space to ask serious questions. That includes questions about decolonization, but just not in the catchphrase Twitter form, right? That includes questions of where the current Ukrainian government sees political development, economic development. That includes serious questions about what degree of freedom in the public sphere and in the media is necessary for Ukraine to have a meaningful conversation with itself, about what it is, over the next years, over the next decade. That's extraordinarily hard, but it's necessary, and Ukraine will be inevitably pushed into it, right? Questions about Ukraine's government are going to be asked in 2024 that didn't need to be asked in 2022, right? There are not questions directly about how they're prosecuting the war. There are questions about what's your vision for the country and what are you doing about it? And the biggest litmus test for this is, for me, the question of how do you feel if you're a Ukrainian who is outside Ukraine, who is left? How keen are you to come back? Or how keen are you to stay away and then get those folks you love out of Ukraine to join you wherever you are in the world? Ukraine needs its people in sufficient numbers to feel very keen to return. That's a very, very important litmus test. This is a very difficult time because you are asking for increasing normalization in a completely abnormal time. You're asking for mobilization to be maintained in certain respects, right, as far as the business of the war goes, but for mobilization to be relaxed in other dimensions, right? That'll happen inevitably, right? People are going to start having more and more politics, more and more conflict, more and more questions are going to be asked, right? So that's an extraordinarily difficult challenge that we need to wish Ukraine well with. And the other side of this, with which we began, is really the conversation of how Ukraine gets a little bit more out of the West. And I'm thinking to, at some point, make a video. It probably will just be a chat, but it could be a main channel video too. What would I say to the West if I were Ukrainian and I wanted more support sooner? So, next.
If Russia wins this war, or if it, to put it
Neil.
very, very modestly, if it is able to retain control of those parts of Ukraine that it currently does control, that land bridge, so-called, that extends right down to Crimea, which it annexed in 2014, that will be the first big defeat of Cold War II for the West, because we were all in. We were all in our support for Zelensky. How many speeches did Western leaders make in support of Ukraine? How many promises did they make? How many pledges were there to be there for as long as it took? If we lose, our credibility is shot.
So, I don't love, taking people out of context. So this is just literally a random 20, 30 seconds of Neil. So I don't think there is a criticism there that says, well, actually, no, we weren't fully in behind the Ukrainian victory. We were behind Ukraine's survival. I don't think that's a criticism. So I rather like the general direction of that point, simply because what it emphasizes rightly is that we have just spent 10 minutes talking about Ukraine kicking the Russians out, Ukraine surviving, Ukraine flourishing. But the Russians don't think in these terms. I mean, the Russians in the Kremlin. To them, Ukraine not succeeding, Ukraine's counteroffensive yielding results that didn't match many people's expectations. That's the West failing. Ukraine not succeeding is seen in the Kremlin as Western weakness. Of course, we can spend an hour adding footnotes to this point, but why don't we just leave it here? It's very important to emphasize this business that they perceive Ukraine not getting those of its aspirations which overlap with the West's as Western failure, Western weakness, and indeed an invitation to carry on what is a project that goes much wider than Ukraine. It's in fact aimed at us, and it'll be a fascinating and uncomfortable watch to see to what extent, if any, we'll wake up to that over the years to come. Let the experiment continue.
The whole point about Islam is that it doesn't recognize a distinction between mosque and state, the way Christianity recognizes a distinction between church and state. Islam is both a religion and a political philosophy. And that political philosophy is not compatible with democracy any more than Sharia law's version of the relation between the sexes is compatible with the modern institutions and norms of the West. That's the problem. And so it makes it hard, indeed it makes it very difficult indeed, for assimilation to be as successful with a large-scale influx of Muslims. That very important philosophical distinction is real, but I still think it's possible to be a believing, devout Muslim and to respect the norms of a Western democracy.
This is a bit beyond us, but we will try. Beyond us, well, because my beloved Bernard Williams, the philosopher at the end of his life, said that he regretted his public appearances because he felt that you're more bound to generate misunderstanding than convey what you actually need to convey when you appear in the newspaper, on the radio. And that's because really Bernard wasn't a public intellectual in the end. He was an extraordinarily brilliant moral philosopher, but not a natural public intellectual. But this tension he felt about it is a product of the fact that for some people these are quite separate hats, and indeed it is for me. So saying what I need to say here about this may be tricky. Not because it's a complex point, it's not, but because it tends to take more than a few minutes. I'll try to give it in a couple of minutes. by really giving you not the point, but the sense that there is a direction available in which the point lies. But Niall is, again, thrown at us by the algorithm. So let's say a bit about him. I have his recent books. I don't read them because they are made for a certain kind of general audience, and I don't therefore have the capacity to assess them. Let me say the big upside with Niall. The downside with someone working like Niall and a little bit with his personality, it's a risk he needs to keep avoiding. That is to overspeak. That is to spend a week in a country and then go around making pronouncements about that country that make country experts roll their eyes a little bit. That's always a risk. It is something he needs to continue avoiding, and he does that well often, but not always. On the positive side, Niall really proved his chops academically at the highest level. His best books are not just good, but beautifully written. He writes, like a dream. How you want the historian to write. One marvelous book is 2001 Cash Nexus, which is an excellent critique of certain ideas of economic determinism in history, given through the lens of an historian. It's a book that I haven't read for over 20 years, but I very much admire it. I'm sure I still do. Now, I've been following Niall's output since his Jesus days, Jesus College, Oxford. And one of the early highlights of Niall in the public sphere was him in the 90s getting involved in the humanitarian intervention debate. Now, on the no side, naturally, in the West, we're moving to the point now, we are enormously big on making a distinction between the religion and the state, the religion and the public sphere, and that certain bits of the public sphere are to have the religious extracted from them. So there's a kind of a division, right? And that's what Niall's speaking to. And one of the problems with our capacity to understand what's going on with Islam is that we're very often stuck in that distinction as though it was something basic when it is in fact a cultural contingency. So one view, right, with a big historical pedigree is to make this big distinction between religion and the public sphere. Another view is to see religious belief as diversity, as one form of diversity among others. And to not have that fundamental distinction that we have. And the fact that that's available is enormously difficult for us to see, actually. Because we tend to say, when something ghastly is going on, and it is delivered in the name of Islam, according to its practitioners, and according to its critics too, we tend to say, well, what you've got to do is extract the religion from that sphere, and that'll fix the problem. Right? Whereas another answer is, of course, just a different interpretation of religion. And so we're having a real problem grasping what it means to live under cultures without that distinction being so central as it is for us. Now, is it true that to have democracy, that distinction needs to be front and center? No, it's not. It's just not. Because rather than extracting something that might be democratically incompatible from the public sphere by saying that it's a religious commitment, therefore it has to go out, we can just say, well, let's rework the religious commitment here. And one of the paradoxes that emerges here is that in reality it's actually not at all easy to say whether something that's done in the name of religion is actually being done, as it were, out of religious belief, out of a religious commitment. It's very difficult to tell that in practice. And so what often ends up happening is that something very challenging and ghastly is going on, like female genital mutilation. Its practitioners say, well, it's in the name of religion. Its critics say, it shows that the problem is the religion here. And so you've got to extract the religion from that sphere. But the reality is that, first of all, that ain't going to happen. And secondly, if anything is going to happen, it isn't going to be the extraction of religion from that sphere, but the reinterpretation of religion. And you get this very paradoxical situation whereby folks like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins are basically mirroring the justifications of fundamentalist, radical practitioners of Islam about ghastly things that might be done, because they say it's in the name of religion, and then Dawkins and Sam Harris come along and say, well, yes, it is in the name of religion, and they have said so. But in reality, that's not how it works. And you've got this typical human problem whereby you substantively reject the position of your opponent, but you adopt the structure of the way they think in doing so. So once we let go of this very, very basic distinction as something that must be a default, we're going to be much better able to ask questions like what's a matter of religion, what's not a matter of religion, what it even means to live under culture and live under a culture in which there isn't that distinction between the religious and the non-religious sphere, and then how we can critique such cultures when we encounter in them a conduct that is completely unacceptable to us. That's the beginning of a conversation. It is undoubtedly unclear what I've said, but at least it's shown that there is something to say in that direction. Next one, please may it be lighter. It will be our last one today. Let us go.
Many people who appear introverted are actually extroverted. The quiet person at a party could be an extrovert, except that they just don't talk very much. The characteristic of an extrovert is somebody that gets energy or feels good from social interactions. They sort of get a lift. And we can predict that that lift occurs because of some release of dopamine within their brain and body. And indeed, there's evidence for that. We can also imagine that the person who's talking a lot is somebody who's very extroverted. But oftentimes people who talk a lot for their work, or there's somebody who is very social when you interact with them, that person gets back to their car and is absolutely depleted and exhausted by that interaction, or all sorts of social interactions. So we really can't predict whether or not somebody is an introvert or an extrovert simply based on their behavior. It's really more of an internal subjective label.
Mm-hmm. That's Andrew Huberman. I think many of you will know who he is. That is roughly right. I mean, let me put it in a narcissistic way. Not narcissistic, really, but just going to talk about me. You can mistakenly think that I'm very much an introvert because I'm in love with solitude. I don't just sit around and I would sit around if my health were better and listen to a lot of music. I do that less, but than I would love. But the point is that it's me to not just sit alone and listen to music, but to listen to music without even listening to music, to go around just listening to music in my head. And if I didn't see a human being for 5 years, I would not be destabilized. So I have, as a philosopher must, an extraordinary capacity for solitude without downsides. But I'm actually, on balance, if you make me sit one of those Myers-Briggs tests, I'm going to come out a marginal extrovert, like something like 52-48. Why? It's because even though so much of the immense fulfillment in my life comes from being alone, and of course I have extraordinary human relationships, and love for me is very much about loving people, not just loving aesthetic creations and human action in the political sphere and moral psychology. So it's of course both alone and not alone, but alone is enormously sustaining for me. It's essential to who I am, and I'd do a lot more of it, of course, if my health gave me more hours in a day. So why the hell am I an extrovert? Marginally. I'm marginally an extrovert because if you said to me tomorrow, Vlad, you're giving a lecture, we're going to bring 1,000 people, you're going to talk about human rights, but you're going to do the lecture naked. The degree of stress that would give me is sort of between 0 and 1. And that's not normal. Or alternatively, if in the times I was really sick in the last few weeks, with my health condition being a bit worse, you shoved the camera or a smartphone in my face and say, Vlad, you're live now on YouTube with a beautiful community. How stressful would that be? Even if I couldn't talk, even if I could say, hi, beautiful community, sending you a hug, but obviously no content today. How stressful would that be for me out of 10? I think between 0 and 1. So what does that mean? It means that as fulfilled as I am by being alone, I am not psychologically drained by being around people at all. And if I were an proper introvert, I would be. My closest friend is an introvert, even though she is in a people-facing role. She's a CEO in the charity sector, in the NGO sector, but it's only with 4 or 5 people she's closest to that she's fully relaxed, such that communicating with them is not draining. Whereas to me, I'm not drained by communicating with anybody. I can be bored or not fulfilled, or I don't want to argue about Brexit with somebody random on the street. But no amount of social interaction drains me. Some social interaction might uplift me, the rest of it will be neutral. So the fact that I'm not drained like that means that I meet the core, really basic ingredient of what it means to be an extrovert, even though somebody who didn't take Andrew's point properly might think, well, hang on, Vlad and solitude go so well together that he's actually going to be an introvert, but I'm not. And the same goes here. My communication with you can be challenging from a health point of view, from a neurological point of view, but it's never psychologically challenging. It's never heavy for me to hold this community and think, well, what are they worried about today? Well, they're freaking out about Ukraine and Putin doing that and this. They're worried about the breakdown of truthful discourse in their societies. They're worried about the climate or something else. And and then they don't like something I've said, but maybe if they found out more, then they would like it. But they won't find out more until I talk about that, and I won't talk about that because I need to talk about this. None of that remotely weighs me down. So wondering how you might be feeling collectively, and there is no collective; we're all individuals. But wondering how you might be feeling just doesn't drain me at all. And so therefore, I am, I suppose, lucky in this sense to be an extrovert, because I get in my particular case, the best of both worlds. But I think the key starting criteria for me always has to be, yes, are you drained by social interaction that you find positive, right? Because my closest friend loves interacting with people outside these 5 or 6 who make her feel sort of completely free and undrained. But she is drained by it. She can do an hour here, 2 hours there, and then nothing for a while. And that is paradigmatically an introvert, somebody who is drained by social interaction they love. Whereas an extrovert is not drained by social interaction that they are so on. Lots of love and talk soon.